So, greetings, everyone. We are so honored to have with us today Swami Medhananda, speaking on Swami Vivekananda on the journey of faith. Some of you probably know his biodata. He is a monk of the Ramakrishna Order, of course, and senior research fellow in philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. Let's see, you were posted there, and was it January 2023?
No. Oh, August 2022.
Oh, August 2022. Okay, so you're an old timer now. From 2010 to 2021, he was associate professor and head of the program in philosophy at the Ramakrishna Mission, Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in Bellarmine, West Bengal. He also serves as Hindu chaplain at both UCLA and at the University of Southern California. And for those of you who don't know, he is the author of 3 books, Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism, Oxford University Press, and Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, also Oxford University Press, and one other, The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency by Bloomsbury. So we do have copies that have just come in on, is it Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism? So that's just come in. The other book is only available through India. So Swami, let us begin. I hope all of you can turn on your video monitors out of respect for the speaker. And there will be questions and answers at the end through the chat box. So please keep your questions on topic. Okay, so let us begin.
Thank you so much, Mataji. My humble pranams to Mataji for inviting me, and thank you all for attending. So my topic today is Swami Vivekananda on the journey of faith, and specifically religious faith. If you study the 9 volumes of his complete works, what you find is that he often talks about faith. If you just do a keyword search on faith in the online version of the complete works, you'll find many, many references. And so that got me thinking, and I thought that it would be interesting to look at, to try to reconstruct Swami Vivekananda's views on faith. And that has culminated in the 8th chapter of my new book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism, which Mataji just mentioned, is published by Oxford last year. If you're just a small brief plug, next Sunday, 12th of February, I'm giving a Sunday talk based on my book in the Hollywood Center, and then followed by a book signing. We have a few copies of the book which we're selling, but most of you are probably not anywhere near Hollywood. But in any case, I thought I'd mention it. So today, I want to give a sort of simplified summary of some parts of chapter 8, one of the main arguments of chapter 8 of my new book. One thing that when you hear the word religious faith, most people, I think, assume that faith means something like belief. I think that's a very typical view. Religious faith means what? It means I believe in God. I believe that God exists. And one thing that I think is really interesting and original about Swamiji's views on faith is that he rejects this idea. He says that it's a mistake to just equate religious faith with belief in God. And he has very interesting and important reasons for believing that. So let's explore that in a bit more detail. As far as I can tell, after having studied the 9 volumes and looking at all the different places where he discusses religious faith, I've come to the conclusion that Swamiji sees religious faith as a journey, not as something static, but as a journey. Our faith evolves. And specifically, our faith evolves in 3 main stages. So I want to explain in some amount of detail what these 3 stages in our journey of religious faith consist in. So let me begin by just summarizing all 3 stages, and then I'm going to explain in more detail each stage one by one. According to Swamiji, the first stage in religious faith, when we just get off the ground with religious faith, we don't believe in God. We don't believe that God exists, but we assent intellectually to the proposition that God exists. He uses this really interesting phrase, intellectual assent, in a number of places in the complete works. He says that faith begins not with belief in God, but with intellectual assent to God. And we're going to talk soon about what he means, what he might mean by intellectual assent as opposed to belief. But first stage is, I assent intellectually to the proposition that God exists. Second stage in religious faith is when I actually believe that God exists. So religious faith does not begin with belief. It's actually a very high state. It's a great achievement to actually believe that God exists. We're going to find that later. But another interesting thing and very original aspect of Swamiji's views on faith is that the journey of faith doesn't end with belief. That belief in God's existence should culminate in the third and final stage, in which I know with absolute certainty that God exists since I've directly realized God. So the journey of religious faith culminates in spiritual realization of God, not just belief, but spiritual realization of God, direct spiritual knowledge that God exists. So this is the brief summary. And so now let's go into a little bit more detail, trying to understand what these three stages are. So the first stage, as I said, is intellectual assent. Where does Swamiji say this, and what does he mean by intellectual assent? So as I already mentioned, he does not simply equate religious faith with religious belief. And he makes this very clear in a passage from the second volume of the Complete Works. So I'll read this slowly and carefully. He says, this is one great idea to learn and to hold on to. This idea of realization. Only the man who has actually perceived God and soul has religion. There is no real difference between the highest ecclesiastical giant who can talk by the volume and the lowest, most ignorant materialist. We are all atheists. Let us confess it. Mere intellectual assent does not make us religious. Not 1 in 20 millions is a real Christian. This is a very powerful and kind of shocking passage to some people, but I think it's very important to meditate on this and really think about what he's saying and why he's saying it and how it's relevant to our spiritual lives. What Swamiji seems to be saying is that the vast majority of people in this world who profess to be religious believers are in fact atheists. He uses very strong language. They're actually atheists. They don't actually believe that God exists so much as they assent intellectually to the proposition that God exists. So now what does he mean by intellectual assent, and how is it different from belief? To help us to understand this distinction he's drawing between intellectual assent on the one hand and belief on the other, I think it's useful to bring in a couple more passages. So another passage. This is from his lecture on the love of God, delivered in 1894. He says, religion nowadays has become a mere hobby and fashion. People go to church like a flock of sheep. They do not embrace God because they need him. Most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. This last sentence is devastating. Most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. Very strong language. You can say arguably harsh language, but he's not doing it to hurt people. He's doing it because he's Jagat Guru, and a spiritual teacher of mankind, of humanity. And he's doing it. He's saying this for the good of spiritual aspirants, people who are on the religious path. And let me read one more passage before I start unpacking what he's saying. Another very strong passage. This is from volume 2. He says, the vast majority of men are atheists. I am glad that in modern times, another class of atheists has come into existence in the Western world. I mean the materialists. They are sincere atheists. They are better than the religious atheists who are insincere, who fight and talk about religion, and yet do not want it. Never try to realize it. Never try to understand it. Remember the words of Christ. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. These words are literally true, not figures or fiction. Who wants God? That is the question. Do you think that all this mass of people in the world want God and cannot get him? That cannot be. Taken together, what is Swamiji saying? And why is he being so harsh toward so-called religious people, or at least many of them? I think what he's saying is, look, it's nice. Religion is a wonderful thing. It's wonderful to be a spiritual aspirant. But one of the great dangers in spiritual life is self-deception. All spiritual progress gets short-circuited the moment that we think that we're more spiritually advanced than we actually are. That's why I think he's being so brutal and so harsh with the people he's addressing. And he's not just addressing Westerners here. In India, he'll say the same thing, except he'll say that not 1 in 20 million Vedantins are true Vedantins. In the West, he's saying not 1 in 20 million Christians are true Christians, you know? So this is not, he's not picking on Westerners. He's saying this is across the board throughout the world. The vast majority of people who talk big about God and religion are not actually believers, and most of them are not even sincere, unfortunately. And it's a fact that we should be honest about ourselves with and ask ourselves where we really stand. So I think that's really, really important. I'll repeat one more time. He says, most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they're devout believers. What does he mean? This is a very psychologically astute observation. I think what he's saying is that most people in religious life, people who consider themselves religious, they're sure that they really think that they believe that God exists. Many of them, because they're not honest with themselves. This is what Swamiji seems to be saying. And so the first step in spiritual life is brutal honesty with oneself. It's going to be painful. It's not a pleasant thing to do, but do I really believe that God exists? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. And it's okay to answer that in the negative. You know, the vast majority of people, if they're honest, should answer in the negative, but that's the starting point in spiritual life, knowing where we stand now, and then trying to move forward from there. So now, why does Swamiji distinguish intellectual assent from belief? What is his justification for distinguishing these two stages in spiritual life? The first stage is not belief in God, but intellectual assent to God's existence. And then only much later in the second stage, do we really believe that God exists? I think what he's saying, and he says this in a number of passages, we're going to find this later. I'll read some passages later in the context of the second stage of faith. He claims that one who truly believes that God exists, feels strongly inclined to act and behave in accordance with the existence of God. Okay, let me give you a simple example. I'm in my house. I need to go out to work, let's say. And I believe that there's going to be a heavy downpour within the next hour. And I'm going to leave in an hour and a half. If I really believe that there's going to be a downpour, what will I do? I'm going to get an umbrella because I don't want to get wet. And I'm not going to leave the door until I bring my umbrella. Now, if I tell somebody, I believe that it's going to rain cats and dogs, and I don't want to get wet, and now I'm going to leave the house. And my friend sees, but wait a minute, you're not taking an umbrella. What does that mean? I might say, oh yeah, then I was just kidding, right? One thing I might say is, oh, I was just kidding. I didn't actually believe that it's going to rain. That's why I'm not taking the umbrella, right? If I really believe it's going to be pouring cats and dogs, raining cats and dogs, I'm going to bring an umbrella. Likewise, if I really believe that God exists, every thought and every action of mine will be different. I'll be transformed. I'll be living a completely different life than ordinary human beings who don't believe in God. Do you see what I mean? So our beliefs are necessarily reflected in our behavior and in our actions. This seems to be the crucial premise in Swamiji's argument about faith. If you really believe in something, whether it's God's existence or whether it's going to rain outside, or whether if you're crossing a street, whether there's a big truck coming towards you, if you really believe that there's a truck coming towards you, what are you going to do? You're going to run out of the way. You're going to jump out of the way as quickly as possible, right? So that seems to be the idea. So by contrast, one who just intellectually assents to the existence of God, but does not believe that God exists, tends to act and behave as if God does not exist. That's the crucial difference between stage one of religious faith and stage two of religious faith. In stage one, I assent intellectually to God's existence, which means I verbally profess that God exists. I tell others, oh, it's by God's will that this happened, by that happened. I tell myself, I might take God's name, maybe as a mantra or whatever. I pray to God, possibly, right? But what happens when I leave the prayer room? What happens when I interact with other human beings? What happens when I get into an argument with somebody? Suddenly I forget about God. Suddenly I have a temper. I become egoistic. All of that behavior, what thoughts am I thinking throughout the day? Am I thinking about God, or am I thinking about all sorts of worldly things? Is my mind full of worldly desires? These are the questions to ask yourself. And if you find that your thoughts and your actions don't reflect belief in God, you can be pretty sure that you don't really believe in God, even if you talk about God's will and this and that. That seems to be what Swamiji is saying. But so don't despair. I mean, a lot of this might sound a little bit harsh and a little bit kind of almost, it might even make you depressed in some way. That's not the purpose of what Swamiji is saying. Let's say we're in phase one, in stage one of religious faith. We don't yet believe in God, in God's existence, if we're honest with ourselves, but we talk about God, we're taking God's name. So Swamiji, at this first stage, he says that there are two different kinds of people at stage one of religious faith, people who intellectually assent to God's existence. He distinguishes between sincere spiritual aspirants and people who just are insincere, who you can't even call them spiritual aspirants. They're insincere people who are stuck at phase one, stage one, but who are convinced that they're already at stage two or three even. They might even think that they've realized God. Okay, so he's saying these guys are beyond the pale. These people who are insincere, who don't engage in any spiritual practice, who talk big about God and religion and tell others and try to convert others to their religion, maybe even kill other people in the name of religion. But they do nothing to purify their minds. They don't do anything serious with regard to spiritual practice. They're just stuck at phase one, thinking that they're already at stage one or stage two or stage three. So he's saying these people are beyond the pale. But there are some people in stage one who are sincere spiritual aspirants. What does that mean? I think what he has in mind are people who are honest enough with themselves to admit, I don't yet believe that God exists. I don't have that level of purity. I don't have that level of belief in God. But I am going to try my best to engage in spiritual practices. Every day, I'm going to sit at least twice a day at fixed times. I might lose my temper once in a while, but I'm going to be honest with myself and do vichara. In Sanskrit, the term is vichara, which means self-reflection. Sometimes it's not going to be pleasant to admit to myself, all my egoistic qualities, but I'm going to try my best. I take it one day at a time and try to remove the ego from the work I'm doing, from my interactions with other people. That's a sincere spiritual aspirant. Okay. And that person knows, look, I don't yet believe that God exists. I don't yet have an overwhelming longing for God. But through sincere spiritual practice and by God's grace, eventually I'll get there. If not in this life, then in a subsequent life, right? Hindus believe in rebirth, and Vedantins also believe in rebirth. And so that's one nice thing, actually. It kind of gives you a bit of relief, because in Orthodox Abrahamic religions, there's no rebirth. And so this life is it. And if you don't attain the goal in this life, you're done for. And in some Orthodox Abrahamic religions actually believe in an eternal hell, which makes things even worse. So some people might be condemned to hell. And so we don't have that. Vedantins don't believe in an eternal hell. Everybody will eventually get salvation. If not in this life, then in a future life. So that should give us solace, okay? It might seem daunting, this journey of religious faith, and when can I move from stage one to stage two? It might be after 10 lives, it might be after 1,000 lives. Just rely on God. Don't obsess so much about how many lives and how do I get to stage 2. Take it one day at a time and focus on your own spiritual practice. Try to be as sincere as possible. Pray to God. Lead a prayerful life. And that's the best we can do. Now, I think that's enough now for you to understand stage 1 in religious faith, which is religious faith as intellectual assent. I don't yet believe that God exists, but I assent intellectually to God's existence, which means I talk about God with other people. I say God's will, thy will be done and all that. But I don't really believe that God exists. Now, what about stage 2? This is a very interesting stage. It's in the second stage of religious faith, which very, very few spiritual aspirants actually reach. This is also a fact. It's not a pleasant fact, but it's a fact, according to Swamiji. Very, very few people ascend or evolve from stage 1 to stage 2 of religious faith. Where does he say this? This is a very long passage, but I'm going to read it carefully and slowly because I think it's very, very important for us to think about this. This is from his lecture, Preparatory and Supreme Bhakti Yoga, delivered in 1896. He says, a great sage used to say, suppose there is a thief in a room, and somehow he comes to know that there is a vast mass of gold in the next room, and that there is only a thin partition between the 2 rooms. What would be the condition of that thief? He would be sleepless. He would not be able to eat or do anything. His whole mind would be on getting that gold. Do you mean to say that if all these people really believed that the mine of happiness, of blessedness, of glory were here, they would act as they do in the world without trying to get God? End quote. So this is the quotation, this great sage. Who is the great sage? Sri Ramakrishna, of course, his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. Then Swamiji continues, as soon as a man begins to believe there is a God, he becomes mad with longing to get to him. Others may go their way, but as soon as a man is sure that there is a much higher life than that which he is leading here, as soon as he feels sure that the senses are not all, that this limited material body is as nothing compared with the immortal, eternal, undying bliss of the self, he becomes mad until he finds out this bliss for himself. And this madness, this thirst, this mania is what is called the awakening to religion. And when that has come, a man is beginning to be religious. But it takes a long time. All these forms and ceremonies, these prayers and pilgrimages, these books, bells, candles, and priests are the preparations. They take off the impurities from the soul. And when the soul has become pure, it naturally wants to get to the mine of all purity, God himself. Just as a piece of iron, now notice he's bringing in another beautiful parable or analogy of Sri Ramakrishna's. Just as a piece of iron, which had been covered with the dust of centuries, might be lying near a magnet all the time, and yet not be attracted by it. But as soon as the dust is cleared away, the iron is drawn by the magnet. So when the human soul, covered with the dust of ages, impurities, wickednesses, and sins, after many births, becomes purified enough by these forms and ceremonies, by doing good to others, loving other beings, its natural spiritual attraction comes. It wakes up and struggles towards God. Okay, it's a long passage, but very, very profound, very moving also. And the whole thing you see comes from his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. He's directly quoting Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Remember, again, according to Swamiji, our beliefs tend to be reflected in our thought and our behavior, our external actions, what we think, what we say. So if we really believe that God exists, we would act and think in accordance with that belief. But what would that mean? It means that we would exert our utmost efforts to realize God for ourselves. We would be mad with longing to get to God, in Swamiji's language. If we really believe that God exists, we would be like that thief who really believed, if he really believed that there's a giant treasure, priceless treasure next door, what would he do? He wouldn't be able to even stay still for 1 second. He'd figure out how to break through that wall and get that treasure. We would be in the same condition if we really believed that God exists, okay? Now, the second analogy that Swamiji mentions, which also comes from Sri Ramakrishna, is also very, very important. This is in the gospel. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, the soul is like a needle and God is like a magnet, like an infinitely powerful magnet, okay? And the soul is naturally attracted to God in the same way that a magnet will just immediately run toward that giant, infinitely powerful magnet, right? Because of that natural attraction that the soul has for God. What's the problem though? Why don't we feel that longing for God, that love for God, that deep attraction for God? Because of the impurities of our mind, because of worldly desires in our heart and mind. So what should be our priority? The priority should be on purifying our minds, getting rid of our worldly desires and our worldly attachments. It's called chitta shuddhi in Sanskrit, purification of the mind. That should be our main priority. That's why Swamiji is so harsh sometimes in his language and in telling people, know where you stand. Why? Because if I already think I'm at stage 2, it means that I already think that I have a very pure mind. And if I have an impure mind and I think I have a pure mind, I've short-circuited all spiritual progress. I won't be able to make any progress in spiritual life. Know where you stand. That's the first step in spiritual life. How pure am I? Analyze yourself with brutal honesty and ask yourself, in the course of the day, how many times did worldly thoughts arise in my mind? How many worldly attachments do I have? How attached am I to my spouse? How attached am I to my work? How attached am I to my children? How attached am I to my prescription medications, to alcohol, to drugs, etc., so on and so forth? Brutal honesty is the first step in spiritual life. Now, of course, Swamiji was well aware that by this criterion, there are very, very few religious believers in the world, in spite of the fact that there are many, many people who, according to Swamiji, for self-serving reasons, confuse intellectual assent with religious belief. The vast majority of people in religious life think they're already at stage 2 or even stage 3, even though they're really stuck at stage 1. This is just an observation, a factual observation, which Swamiji makes about most people in spiritual life. That's why he says, and I'm going to repeat this a 4th time, most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. Unconscious atheists. That's why he says, I at least respect those materialistic atheists who are outspoken atheists. In modern times, we have somebody called Richard Dawkins. Some of you might be familiar with him. He's a famous professor at Oxford University. His field is biology, but he's published a bunch of books attacking religion, basically. There's a book he wrote called The God Delusion, in which he claims that Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory has definitively debunked religion. God can't possibly exist. Darwin has disproved God. I imagine Swamiji saying, if he were living now, he'd say, I respect Richard Dawkins at least, because he's honest. He doesn't believe that God exists, and he doesn't pretend that God exists. And he doesn't tell other people that he thinks that God exists. And he thinks that these so-called religious people who talk big about God, who fight other people in the name of God, who sometimes kill other people in the name of God, but actually never engage in spiritual practices, he says they're much worse than outspoken atheists like Richard Dawkins, because they're deceiving themselves and they're deceiving others. That's the difference. Okay. Now, again, you might ask, well, Swamiji, okay, so Swamiji seems to think that there are very few people in spiritual life and religious life who actually believe that God exists. But is that really consistent with Sri Ramakrishna's views? A question could come, because we've already seen that Swamiji is often quoting from Sri Ramakrishna. So what did Sri Ramakrishna think about this? Swamiji himself quotes Sri Ramakrishna as saying that not 1 in 20 millions in this world believe in God. This is taken from volume 1 of the Complete Works, page 407. He quoted Sri Ramakrishna as saying that not 1 in 20 millions in this world believed in God. And actually, in the gospel, many of you, I'm sure, have studied the gospel carefully, if not in Bengali, then in some translation, presumably English. In the gospel, there's a startling statement he makes on page 220 of the gospel, in Nikhilanandi's translation, and page 185 of the one volume Bangla Kathamrita. He says, one cannot even believe that God exists until one's heart becomes pure. Sri Ramakrishna is saying this. One cannot even believe that God exists until one's heart becomes pure. Antor shuddho na hole Ishwar achen bole bishwashi hoy na. Antor shuddho na hole Ishwar achen bole bishwashi hoy na. Very, very strong language. As strong language as Swamiji's, you see. So Swamiji is actually taking after his master, Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna also would say harsh things when he felt it was necessary for the betterment of and for the spiritual progress of the people who are visiting him. So now, you might ask, okay, I'm trying to be brutally honest with myself. I'll be honest, I'm not at stage 2. I don't yet believe that God exists. But I've been initiated. My guru has taught me how to do meditation, and I'm taking a mantra. I've taken a mantra and I repeat that mantra mentally twice a day. So what do I do? So I think what Swamiji meant is that if you're a sincere spiritual aspirant, you should admit to yourself you don't yet believe that God exists. It's possible that you do, but that means that you have a really, really you have a very, very pure mind and you don't have any worldly desires. And I mean, how many people can really say that? But let's assume you're not at that evolved spiritual stage, okay? So we're at stage 1, but we're sincere. What do? We engage sincerely in spiritual disciplines to the best of our ability. What Swamiji refers to in that long passage that I read out to you as forms and ceremonies, prayers and pilgrimages. We can add japa, meditation, renunciation of worldly attachments and pleasures, and all the things that go into spiritual practice. Karma yoga is another very potent form of spiritual practice, which is very practical for many of us who have to, we have a day-to-day, we have a 9-to-5 job and we've got a family to look after. Even that, try to spiritualize that work. Try to spiritualize your relationship with your spouse, with your children, okay? What's the purpose of all these spiritual practices? Swamiji says the purpose of all spiritual practice is to take off the impurities from the soul. This is his language. It purifies the mind and the heart. That's the purpose of all spiritual practice. Once our minds become sufficiently purified, we're like that needle, which is naturally attracted to this infinitely powerful magnet, which is God. But because we have impure minds, because our minds are full of worldly desires, we don't feel that natural attraction for God. So once we purify our minds through spiritual practices performed in the course of many lifetimes, Swamiji even mentions rebirth in that same passage I read out to you. He says many births. This is not a journey of one life, it's a journey of many lives. And Brahmaprana ji is a nun, and I'm a monk, but we became monks in this life probably because we were already engaged in spiritual practices in a previous life. This is a journey of many lives. In the Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 6, Bhagavan Krishna says, Aneka janma samsiddhas tato yati parangatim. Having become purified in the course of many lifetimes, many physical embodiments, one attains spiritual perfection. This is what Krishna says in the Gita. This is exactly what Swami Vivekananda is saying here as well. Now, another important thing to keep in mind is, once we purify our minds through spiritual practices performed sincerely in the course of many lifetimes, by the grace of God, eventually, the belief in God should arise spontaneously in our hearts. Belief is not something that's under our voluntary control, okay? That's something that's very important to keep in mind. And I'm going to have to, please bear with me. I just mentioned to Brahmaprana ji that I gave a much more academic version of this talk at Oxford University last year. And so I'm not going to go into all the technical details, but I want to flag one thing. One doctrine in contemporary analytic philosophy, there's a field within philosophy called epistemology, which is the philosophical study of knowledge, okay? And belief, actually. And there's a view in contemporary Western philosophy called doxastic voluntarism. It's a big mouthful. I'll say it again. Doxastic voluntarism. It sounds fancy, but it's actually a very simple idea. Doxastic is an adjective referring to belief, okay, of or pertaining to belief. Doxa, okay. Voluntarism means doing something voluntarily. So what does doxastic voluntarism mean according to these philosophers? It's the view that we can just voluntarily choose to believe in something. I can just decide to believe that the capital of California is Los Angeles. Can I? Try it right now. Can you just voluntarily adopt the belief that the capital of California is Los Angeles? I bet you'll fail, right? So this view is actively being discussed and debated by philosophers. And most philosophers now believe that doxastic voluntarism is bogus. So most contemporary philosophers are the opposite. They are doxastic involuntarists. That means that they believe that belief is not under our voluntary control. We can't just choose to believe in something. And that, of course, equally applies to God. It would be wonderful if we could just choose to believe that God exists, but it's not that easy. No belief is that easy. That's why I said, even something, forget about God. If is the capital of California Los Angeles? Well, no. That's why I can't choose to believe that the capital of California is Los Angeles. We can't believe anything that's not true. And so unless we have engaged in many, many spiritual practices sincerely in the course of many lifetimes, that belief will never arise in our hearts. But even then, it's never a voluntary choice. We never just say, okay, now I can believe that God exists. No, it's by God's grace that the belief in God spontaneously arises in our hearts and minds. That's the way that belief formation works. So according to Swamiji, we cannot voluntarily ascend from the first stage of intellectual assent to the second stage of belief that God exists. So there's an important difference here between stage 1 and stage 2. There are many differences, but one difference is we can voluntarily choose to engage in spiritual disciplines. We can voluntarily choose to be brutally honest with ourselves and ask ourselves, where do we really stand? How pure am I? How many worldly desires and attachments do I really have? Do I really believe that God exists? All that stuff is voluntary. I'm going to engage in karma yoga. I'm going to engage in bhakti yoga. I'm going to engage in jnana yoga, all voluntary. But I cannot voluntarily choose to believe that God exists. That's not in our hands. That's up to God. But what we can do, what is in our hands, is we should try to engage in spiritual practices to the best of our ability and to be honest with ourselves to the best of our ability. Ultimately, through all of the spiritual practice, we're preparing the necessary conditions for the spontaneous arising of belief in God in our hearts, which is not under our direct control. That seems to be Swamiji's idea. So that's enough technical philosophy. So now a few more points I wanted to make. I've talked about stage 1 of intellectual assent, talked about stage 2, faith as genuine belief that God exists. If I really believe that God exists, how will I behave? What will I think about? I will have an intense longing to realize God. I will be mad, as if mad to realize God. What's the best example in modern times? The life of Sri Ramakrishna. He said, when he was talking about that period in his life, he said, I was like a crazy person. I was obsessed with God. Another thing that's really interesting, which some of us forget, in the midst of during that spiritual practice period in his life, this is recorded in Sharadananda's Leela Prasanga, the divine play of Sri Ramakrishna. He says at one point, and this is like he had that intense longing for God. Even then, he looks at Kali, at the image of Kali in the temple, and says, is it true that you're real, that what the sages say, is it true that what the sages say is true, that God exists, that you exist, O mother? Or are you just a piece of clay? Are you nothing but stone? Imagine somebody at his level of spiritual evolution who has a purer mind than Sri Ramakrishna, who had more longing for God, but even then he was doubting whether God existed, whether his beloved Kali actually existed. And who are we compared to Sri Ramakrishna? So that's what I'm saying, is that belief in God is a very, very high achievement. Oh, I wanted to mention one more thing before I get to stage 3. This is also at the very end of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in the English edition and in the original Bengali. This is after Sri Ramakrishna leaves his body, 1887. Swamiji is talking to his brother disciple Prashanna, who later became Swami Trigunatitanandaji, who was the head of the San Francisco Center for some time. Swamiji says to Trigunatitananda, so long as one has desires and cravings, one does not believe that God exists. So long as one has desires and cravings, one does not believe that God exists. The original Bangla, Jotokkun kamona bashana, totokkun ishwarke abishwash. Jotokkun kamona bashana, totokkun ishwarke abishwash. You do not have vishvasa, you do not have belief in God, so long as there are any kamanas or vasanas in the heart, any worldly desires, any worldly attachments. It's a very strong statement. It sets the bar very high for religious belief. But again, what Swamiji seems to think and what Sri Ramakrishna seems to think, these are statements of fact. Whether they're pleasant facts or not is a kind of separate question. Now, coming back. So what is stage 3? If we're already at stage 2, it means that we're very, very sincere. Our minds are very pure. We have an intense longing to realize God. We're in fact consumed with this longing to realize God. That's all we can think about. That's all we can sort of, anything where all our actions and our behavior reflects that intense longing to realize God. That longing for God, when it becomes sufficiently intense, results by God's grace in the direct realization of God, which is the third and final stage of religious faith. Notice that Swamiji is not saying, if you do this amount of japa, this amount of meditation, and you purify your mind this much, then you will realize God. No, there's no such formula. That's not the way that spiritual life works, because there's a grace factor. And because belief is not, so just as belief is not under our direct control, God realization is certainly not under our direct control. We can't just choose to realize God. And here again, brutal honesty with oneself is very, very necessary. Actually, I'm finding this more and more after coming back to the US. I came back to the US after living in India for 13 years. And it's very funny. After some of my lectures, there's a Q&A, and somebody will almost invariably raise their hand and say, instead of asking a question about the lecture, they start talking for about 5 minutes about their grand spiritual experiences. And, I try to be as polite as possible, but what I say is, don't throw pearls before swine. If you really had a spiritual experience, first of all, this is not the place or the time to be talking about it. Talk to your guru about it, if you talk to anybody about it. But it's better to keep it to yourself. And then, if that person can take it, I'll also add, but you should really also ask yourself, is it really a spiritual experience that I've had? Or was it a momentary enthusiasm that I'm mistaking for a spiritual experience? These are serious questions, which I think need to be asked by every sincere spiritual aspirant. It's very common in the West now, especially the marijuana is legalized, hallucinogenics in some states have become legal. And so everybody and their mother is having quote unquote spiritual experiences. And I think this is, it's becoming more and more difficult to be a sincere spiritual aspirant in these days and times. We've got to, if we're honest with ourselves. Now, okay, sorry. So that was a bit of a digression, but I think it's important. Now, where does Swamiji describe stage 3 in this journey of religious faith? He says, he describes this third and final stage in many places, but in his lecture called Realization, delivered in London in 1896, he says, if you have seen a certain country and a man forces you to say that you have not seen it, still, in your heart of hearts, you know you have. So when you see religion and God in a more intense sense than you see this external world, nothing will be able to shake your belief. Then you have real faith. Notice this last sentence. Then you have real faith. What does he mean by real faith? I think what he means is this is the culminating stage in religious faith, the third and final stage in religious faith. You don't have real faith so long as you just assent intellectually to God's existence. You don't even have real faith, according to Swamiji, when you believe that God exists. Why? Because it's only belief. You don't yet know for sure that God exists. So you only have real faith. You have only reached the end of the journey of religious faith when you have realized God. That's what Swamiji seems to be saying. And when you have realized God, you will feel the reality of God as more real than this table in front of me, the people that you're talking to, your loved ones. God is more real to you than anything else in this world. And you can't possibly doubt that God exists, because it would be crazy for you to doubt that God exists. Just as it would be crazy for you to doubt that this world exists. But in a more intense sense, you feel that God exists. So the one thing that's, I think, really important about this journey of religious faith for Swamiji is that even if religious faith starts with what's called blind faith sometimes, right? We don't have proof that God exists, but nonetheless, we have faith in the scriptures, in the testimony of great sages throughout the world who talk about God and say that God exists. If you do X, Y, and Z, then you too can realize God. But the beauty of this journey of religious faith, as charted out by Swamiji, is that faith should culminate in direct experiential verification of the truth of religion. Because when we attain spiritual realization of God, we know for sure that God exists, and we know, we've confirmed that our belief in God was correct. That's the nice thing. It's very scientific, right? Religious faith should culminate in direct experiential verification that God exists. In exactly the way that a scientist verifies whether, adding chemical X with chemical Y will result in chemical Z. Now, I want to just end with a few points about, you might ask, well, how is this related to our spiritual practice? I've already kind of covered some of these points. And, don't be daunted by this. Don't be discouraged by this, because that's not the purpose of Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna saying all these things. It's not to discourage anybody, okay? I think what both Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji are saying is the first step in spiritual practice, the first step in spiritual life is brutal self-honesty, brutal honesty with oneself. And this, I don't think this is emphasized often enough. Everybody wants spirituality to be easy. They want shortcuts, either through drugs or to give it, they want to deceive themselves into thinking that they've already had massive spiritual experience. I've already realized God. This is very common these days. This is very, very dangerous in spiritual life. Swamiji makes another very strong statement in another place where he says, roughly, he says, among those who take to spiritual life, 80% become cheats, 15% become mad, and only 5% succeed. 80% become cheats, 15% become mad, and 5% succeed. Same idea. That 80%, we ask ourselves first, which category do we belong to? Are we in the 80%, in the 15%, or in the 5%? And unfortunately, the people who are crazy don't usually know that they're crazy. So that 15% is it's very difficult to know whether you're in that category. But at least in terms of the cheats, most cheats know that they're cheating. That's one thing. That's the difference between a crazy person and a cheat. A cheat will deliberately cheat. At least they'll cheat other people knowingly. Now, cheating yourself in spiritual life is actually trickier, because many times, that's why Swamiji says most religious people are unconscious atheists. They don't know that they're deceiving themselves. I don't know. I don't even know that I'm deceiving myself in the thinking that I actually believe in God and I've already had all these spiritual experiences. And because of that, I'm deceiving myself and cheating myself without knowing it. I am preventing myself from making any further spiritual progress because I'm in that 80% category without knowing it. And while thinking that I've already succeeded and that I've already realized God, or that I already believe in God. So hypocrisy and self-deception are huge dangers in spiritual life, especially in these days and times. Why are they so dangerous? Because they prevent us from making any further spiritual progress. So, practical takeaway, ask yourself, where do I stand right now in this very moment? What stage am I in, if I'm really honest with myself? Secondly, let's say I'm in stage 1. Okay, don't get discouraged. Let me engage to the best of my ability, sincerely, and in the spiritual practices that I feel inclined toward, that I have time to do. Try to remove the ego from everything I'm doing in my day-to-day life, whether it's work or interacting with family or interacting with loved ones or with friends or with coworkers. And ultimately, let me be humble. Let me surrender to the Lord, and let God decide when I will eventually have true faith, true belief in God. And let God purify my mind, but let me, on my side, to the best of my ability, engage in spiritual practices, because that's what's in our hands. Okay? Thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to hear from you now.
Swami, thank you for such a thoughtful talk. Nothing has come through the chat box yet. You're welcome to send your questions through the chat box, please, and we'll choose those that are on topic. Just a couple comments I'd like you to comment on. I think what was so important was the emphasis on vichara, and how important that self-analysis is. And sometimes that is spurred on by the people we live with. And that's why our monastic communities are so helpful to us in our spiritual life. And in the case of householders, your family life. Because when you feel you're becoming holier than thou, you have observers who can pull you back to where you are. Right. Okay.
That's a great point. Thank you.
One thing that you stressed, and I feel is so important, is that longing for God. And that comes, yes, through sadhana. That's very helpful. But in my experience, what little I've seen, it also comes through obstacles. Yeah. And I'm talking about ill health, tragedy, loss, losing a job. Would you like to comment on these things that come into our life that we may separate out from what is spiritual, but how to turn these opposite forces into spiritual sadhana?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. I really like that. And, you know, Swamiji, he used to say, suffering is the great eye-opener. Suffering is the great eye-opener. And another one of his statements that I really like, and I say this a lot, especially to young people who ask me about Vedanta and spirit, I say, look, you don't have to believe in God or any of this, but take this statement of Swamiji's. He said, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. And I think that's very, very helpful in our day-to-day lives. Whatever the experience, and it could be an experience of extreme suffering, anguish, tragedy. It could be an experience of extreme joy. I get into my dream school, I get the dream job, or this and that. But always try to have this attitude of a learner. What can I learn from this experience, whether joyful or sorrowful or devastating? And what you'll often find is we think most of God in the depths of suffering, and we think the least of God in the heights of joy. When we are happy, often we pat ourselves on the back and say, see, I did such a great job. That's why I got the job. I'm so brilliant. That's why I got into this school. When we suffer and we have nobody else to turn to, then we turn to God, you know? And so in a way, Swami Tapasanandaji, he has a beautiful book called Spiritual Quest. I recommend it. Many people don't even know about this book. It's kind of an obscure book. And I'm not even sure if it's available widely or whether it's available online. Spiritual Quest by Swami Tapasanandaji. He was a past vice president of our order. There's, as far as I remember, there's a devotee who was undergoing some form of tragedy, some suffering. And he, in his response, in a letter, he used this beautiful Sanskrit term, which I really like. I want to mention in this context. The phrase is viparita kripa. Viparita kripa. Kripa means God's grace. Viparita in Sanskrit means in the form of its opposite. So viparita kripa means you're receiving God's grace without knowing it. You think that, so what he has in mind is these moments of great tragedy, great suffering, great anguish. When we think that God is far away from us, when we might think, why the heck did God do this to me? What did I do to deserve this? This is actually God's grace in the form of its opposite. So I think that's very much in line with what you were saying, Mataji.
Yes, absolutely. Also, you spoke to hallucinogenics as an obstacle to spiritual life. We found that also when devotees repeat their spiritual experience to others, and others begin to imagine also that they're having a similar experience. So you spoke to the dangers of both. Is there anything you wish to add to that? Spiritual imagination, feeling you're having a spiritual experience when in fact you're not. How can we prevent that from happening in our spiritual life?
I think that Swamiji gives us a very practical test. He says, ask yourself, if you think you've had a spiritual experience, what is the fruit of that experience? Has my love for God increased? Am I pure in heart? And if you can answer these questions in the affirmative, then at least you have some better reason to feel that the spiritual experience might be genuine. But, Sri Ramakrishna also used to say, igiye cholo, in Bengali, which means keep moving forward. Don't become complacent. Remember, notice again that sentence that I kept saying over and over again during my talk today. Most people are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are pious believers, devout believers. Complacency is the death of spiritual life. Never be satisfied with where you are. And if you started meditation 6 months ago or 6 years ago and you think that you realize God, you better think again. From the vast majority of people. There are some exceptions, but in general, I just think that probably 98% of people these days who think that they have spiritual experiences probably haven't. But it could be. So the thing is, but I want to distinguish, there are still heightened experiences that are not necessarily spiritual experiences, which are still very helpful in spiritual life. I'll give you an example. I'm a student of poetry. I love music. And, when I listen to sacred classical music, I often feel very moved by it. And I feel a certain bhakti for God. I'm not going to make the mistake of calling that a spiritual experience, but does it help me in my spiritual life? Sure. Is it a form of spiritual practice? Sure. Does it help intensify my devotion toward God? Yes. Right? But I'm not enough of a fool to think that that's a spiritual experience. It's an aesthetic experience. And if I were of the caliber of a Sri Ramakrishna, if I hear 2 words of that song, that would send me in the highest kind of samadhi. But I'm not him. And I'm trying to be honest with myself, right? I mean, that's just an example.
One question we've got here is, being householders, can you please give examples on giving up desires? We all are looking for earning a living. Does this mean we are attached to material world? So please.
Yeah. So, what Sri Ramakrishna used to say to householders is live like the mudfish, which is in the mud, but without letting the mud stick to it. So that means live in the world, but try to live in a detached way, in a detached spirit. And so he would say, okay, you have children, you have a wife, that's great. But always remember, your children are not yours. Your wife is not even yours. It might sound weird or jarring. Well, if they're not mine, then whose are they? That might be the question. But the answer is they're God's. We're all children of God. My children are not mine. They're also God's children, just as I'm God's child. My wife is not mine. She's also God's child. And with respect to marriage, this is a sensitive issue, especially in the West, but it's worth saying. What does Sri Ramakrishna say to newlyweds and to married couples? He would say, after having 1 or 2 children, try to live with your spouse like brother and sister. How many married people in the world actually try to practice this? You could probably count them on your hand. But that's spiritual practice. Try progressively to spiritualize your marriage. That doesn't mean overnight. That usually doesn't happen overnight. But if you get stuck at the age of 70 buying Viagra, I think that means that you're not a sincere spiritual aspirant.
Swami, Swami Prabhupada used to say that there are 2 kinds of aspirants. There are those who are mystics and those who are non-mystics. And he said many times, and he mentioned a brother disciple of his, disciple of Maharaj. He doesn't have mystical experiences, but at the end, he'll have the highest experience. Will you speak to that? This craving for spiritual experiences can also be an obstacle.
Yeah, there are different kinds of spiritual aspirants, and there are some who's, I've even seen this when I interact with some devotees, and some of them, just recently, somebody came to Hollywood and, was kind of hinting at, he wanted to talk to me about his spiritual experience, and I just was not interested. So I just kind of like, keep those to yourself, please. But, and I just, so yeah, but there are different kinds of people, and they might have been genuine, who knows? But if you had them, keep them to yourself. And I think that there are different temperaments. And one type is they crave experiences from the beginning, and it's like an important part of their spiritual life to a certain extent. But I think that there's a danger there. I talked to Swami Vivekananda about this many times, because when I attend some of his lectures, same thing happens, question answer. I have had X, Y, and Z spiritual experiences, and he's always very generous with them and whatever. But and then he's laughing, and he told me later when we were talking about it privately, he said, yeah, it's very funny. All these householder disciples who just got initiated by me 6 months ago, they're talking about their spiritual experience. How come us monks never have spiritual experiences? But, that's a joke. But part of the idea is that one thing about at least some monks is that they can be more honest with themselves. That's part of why we're monks, is because we know how hard spiritual life is. It's not a walk in the park. And it takes great sacrifice and renunciation, and to make spiritual progress. But I just feel like there is a lot of self-deception in spiritual life. I think that, it's better to try to be humble in spiritual life and not to crave spiritual experiences so much. And actually, the better craving to have in spiritual life is craving for purity. Yeah. Craving for purity of mind and heart, craving to be a nirvashana. That's why Holy Mother said, if you pray to God, pray for nirvashana. Pray to be nirvashana. Pray for desirelessness.
Right.
That's the craving that I think is more practical in spiritual life.
That brings to a point, a very important point, is that this craving for experience, when you look at a person's character, that speaks volumes about their spirituality.
Absolutely, yeah. The other thing is, yeah, please, Mataji.
They may not be inclined to the path of spiritual experience, but our teachers have told us at the very end of their life, they will get the highest.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. The other thing is something I haven't mentioned, but I think is also important. Almost nobody wants to be a disciple, but everybody wants to be a guru. And that, I think, is part of the reason, the impulse behind pretending you have spiritual experiences that you haven't actually had. Because then that's the only way to earn spiritual street cred. Yes, I've realized God, I'm enlightened, I've realized the Atman. If you haven't, you're not gonna be able to be a guru. And you've got to grow out a nice big beard, flowing beard, a little salt and pepper beard. And otherwise you're not gonna have disciples. But it's better as a spiritual aspirant, be a disciple before you become a guru. And never covet being a guru. Never desire to be a guru. Never desire to help others. First, help yourself. Help others spiritually. You can help others materially in all sorts of ways. Serve them in many ways.
Speaking of that, never desire to be a guru, but what is the danger of not having a guru?
Yeah, this is another, I think, a big problem, especially in the West, where there's kind of people who are, I'm about to give a lecture on spiritual, it's called Spiritual But Not Religious, ? Here in Trabuco. And part of the problem is that people are it's like a religion of one many times, where it's like, it's a form of ego in a certain sense, where it's like, I'm too good to belong to a religious tradition, to belong to a church, to have a guru. I don't want somebody to tell me what to do. I'm my own boss. It's this feeling of independence. I'm asserting my independence and my freedom. And ask yourself whether that's not it's a disguised form of ego.
Very good point. Swami, I think we've gone over time now. I want to thank you for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk, and we look forward to hearing many more in the future. So on behalf of all of our devotees, our trustees and advisors, I wish to thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mataji. Maybe we can close with the mantra.
Yes.
Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Jai Ma, Jai Thakur.
Jai Ma. We have a few announcements. Swami, you're welcome to go at any time. We will